I need you to understand something before I tell you what happened on my porch 3 weeks ago. For 10 years, I had a recurring dream. Not a nightmare exactly, but close enough that I'd wake up with my heart slamming against my ribs and my sheets soaked through with sweat. In the dream, I'm underwater, except it's not water, it's twisted metal and shattered glass, and there's a hand reaching through the wreckage, grabbing my wrist so hard it left bruises that lasted for weeks after the actual accident. Because this wasn't just a dream. It was a memory replaying itself, night after night, for a decade. On October the 3rd, 10 years ago, I was driving home from my cousin's wedding on Route 9 when a truck ran a red light and hit my car so hard it flipped 3 times before landing in a drainage ditch. I remember the smell of gasoline. I remember the sound of the radio still playing some pop song through the twisted dashboard. And I remember a face. A man's face, half lit by the glow of a street lamp, leaning into the wreckage and saying, "Stay with me, I've got you," over and over while he pried the door open with his bare hands until his knuckles bled. He pulled me out seconds, maybe less, before the gas tank caught fire. Paramedics said if he'd been 30 seconds slower, I wouldn't be alive to tell you this story. And then he vanished. Before the ambulance even arrived, before I could ask his name, before I could do anything but grip his sleeve and sob, "Thank you," into the night air, he was gone. I spent years trying to find him. I put up posts online, contacted local news stations, even hired someone to comb through traffic camera footage, but he never showed up anywhere. It was like the universe had sent me a guardian angel and then erased every trace of him the moment his job was done. So 3 weeks ago, when my doorbell camera lit up my phone at 9:47 on a Tuesday night, I wasn't expecting anything more than a delivery driver or a neighbor asking to borrow something. I glanced at the screen out of habit, already halfway back to my dinner, and then I stopped breathing. Because standing on my porch, illuminated by that same cold porch light I'd installed 2 years ago, was the exact same face from my dream. Older, yes. A little more weight around the jaw, a few more lines by the eyes. But it was him. 10 years of searching, 10 years of dead ends and disappointment, and there he was, standing 3 feet from my front door like he'd simply been waiting for the right moment to appear. My hand started shaking so badly I nearly dropped the phone. Every instinct in my body told me to run downstairs, throw the door open, and finally say the thank you I'd been holding onto for a decade. But there was something else underneath that instinct, something quieter and colder, whispering that I should look a little closer before I opened that door. That I stood there in my hallway for what felt like a full minute, just staring at that grainy little rectangle on my phone screen, my thumb hovering over the button to unlock the door. Part of me wanted to laugh at myself for hesitating. This was the man who pulled me out of a burning car. This was the person I owed my entire existence to, the reason I got to watch my daughter learn to ride a bike, the reason I got to celebrate 10 more birthdays, 10 more Christmases, 10 more ordinary Tuesday mornings that I almost never got to have. You don't leave a person like that standing on your porch. You don't make him wait. So I told myself I was being paranoid, that a decade of unresolved trauma was playing tricks on my nervous system, and I walked downstairs and opened the door. Up close, he looked smaller than I remembered, which is strange because in my dreams he'd always felt larger than life, almost mythic. He smiled at me, a warm, practiced kind of smile, and said my name before I'd even introduced myself. I remember blinking at that, thinking, well, of course he knows my name. It was probably in the news coverage after the crash. He said he'd been meaning to find me for years, that he'd finally worked up the courage, that he just wanted to see how I was doing. I invited him in without a second thought. I made him coffee. I sat him down at my kitchen table, the same table where my daughter does her homework, and I thanked him. I actually started crying, ugly, gasping sobs, the kind you can't control, because I was finally saying words I'd rehearsed 1,000 times in the mirror to a man I thought I'd never see again. He reached across the table and patted my hand, and told me it was okay, that he was just glad I was alive. And for about 15 minutes, it really did feel like a miracle. It felt like the universe had finally closed a loop that had been open and bleeding for 10 years. But then he asked to use the bathroom, and instead of asking where it was, he walked straight down the hallway like he already knew. I told myself he must have asked a neighbor, Or maybe I mentioned the layout of my house on one of those old online posts, back when I was desperate enough to share anything that might help someone recognize me. But a small, cold seed had already been planted in my stomach, and it did not go away. When he came back, he glanced at the photos on my hallway wall a little too long. Photos of my daughter. Photos of her school, her soccer team, her birthday parties. And he said something that I didn't think much of in the moment but that I have not been able to stop replaying since. He said, "She looks just like you did at that age." I hadn't shown him a single picture of myself as a child. I hadn't even mentioned my daughter's age. That single sentence sat in the room like a held breath. "She looks just like you did at that age." I remember forcing out a small, nervous laugh and saying something like, "Oh, everyone says that," just to fill the silence before it got too heavy to ignore. He didn't correct himself. He didn't explain how he'd know that. He just smiled, that same warm, practiced smile, and settled back into his chair like nothing unusual had just left his mouth. I told myself I was overthinking it, that 10 years of unresolved trauma will make you read danger into innocent comments, make you flinch at shadows that were never really there. So I did what any grateful person would do. I poured him more coffee, sat back down across from him, and asked him to finally tell me the story. In 10 years, I had never once heard the accident described by anyone but myself, from the broken, adrenaline-soaked fragments I remembered while half-conscious and terrified. I wanted the full picture. I wanted, more than anything, to finally understand the night that had haunted my sleep for a decade. And he gave it to me in vivid, almost cinematic detail. He described the exact angle my car had landed at in the ditch. The color of the sparks that jumped off the guardrail. The specific song that had been playing on my radio, a detail I hadn't even remembered until he said it, and it clicked into place like a missing puzzle piece sliding home. In that moment, I was so moved, so grateful, that I didn't stop to ask the obvious question. How does a random passerby, someone who supposedly just happened to be driving down Route 9 that night, remember that level of detail a full 10 years later? People forget accidents they were directly involved in. They remember the loud parts, the screech of tires, the impact, maybe the smell of smoke. They don't remember song lyrics. But I said nothing. I just nodded, still riding the emotional high of finally getting answers I'd waited a decade for, while that cold seed planted earlier in my stomach kept growing heavier with every perfectly detailed sentence. Then he said something so casually I almost missed it entirely. He mentioned he'd been driving behind me for almost 20 minutes before the truck ran the light. Not simply in the area that night. Behind me. For 20 minutes. On a quiet road, late at night, after a wedding, where I hadn't passed more than 2 or 3 other cars the whole drive home. I felt my stomach drop somewhere near the floor. I asked him, as casually as I could manage, how he happened to be on that exact stretch of road at that exact time. There was a pause. Brief, maybe half a second, but I saw it, that small flicker behind his eyes, the look of someone quietly deciding which version of the truth to hand me. He said it was fate, that he'd been coming from his own family gathering nearby. It was a good answer. Almost believable. But I've replayed that drive 1,000 times in my head, and something about the direction he claimed to be heading has never once lined up. That I didn't push it any further that night. I let the silence sit between us for a moment too long, then changed the subject to something safer, something small, like asking if he wanted more coffee or if he'd eaten dinner yet. It's strange, the things you do when your body is screaming at you to be afraid but your mind hasn't fully caught up. You become polite. Almost aggressively polite, like good manners can somehow paper over the growing unease sitting in the room with you. He stayed for almost 2 hours that first night. 2 hours of stories, laughter, moments where I genuinely forgot to be suspicious and just felt grateful, truly grateful, that the man who saved my life was sitting at my kitchen table instead of remaining a ghost in my memory. But underneath all of it, I started noticing small things I couldn't notice once I saw them. He knew which cabinet held the mugs before I opened it for him. He referred to my street by a nickname only people who'd lived here for years would use, not something you'd find on a map or in a news article. And when my phone buzzed with a text from my daughter, who was at a sleepover, he glanced at the screen just a fraction of a second too long before I turned it face down. I told myself, again and again, that grief and trauma make people paranoid, that I was projecting a decade of unresolved fear onto a man who had done nothing but save my life and now wanted a simple reconnection. But that night, after he finally left, thanking me for the coffee and promising to visit again soon, a promise that suddenly felt less like kindness and more like a warning, I sat in my kitchen for almost an hour just staring at the door. My daughter came home the next morning, tired and happy from her sleepover, and I remember watching her walk through that same front door, laughing about something her friend said, completely unaware that hours earlier a stranger had stood in this exact kitchen asking careful questions about her age, her school, her routine. And that's when the fear finally caught up to the gratitude. Because a person who simply wants to reconnect with someone they saved doesn't ask which school your daughter attends. They don't ask what time she usually gets home. They don't ask, almost offhandedly, whether you still keep a spare key hidden outside for emergencies. I had answered every single one of those questions without hesitation, because he was my hero, because I owed him everything, because for 10 years I had built him up in my mind as the one unquestionably good thing that came out of the worst night of my life. It wasn't until I was lying awake at 3 a.m, replaying every sentence he'd said, that I realized how much information I had willingly handed over to a man I had known, in reality, for only a few hours. Over the next several days, I told myself I would be more careful, that I would keep some distance, maybe meet him in public next time if he reached out again. But he didn't wait for me to reach out. 2 days later, my doorbell camera lit up again, this time at almost 10 at night, well past the hour anyone would consider appropriate for an unannounced visit. I watched the live feed from my phone, my heart pounding, and saw him standing there holding a small gift bag, smiling up at the camera like he knew exactly where it was mounted, which struck me as strange because most visitors glance around trying to find it. He knew precisely where to look. I didn't answer the door that night. I told myself I was busy, that it was too late, that we could catch up another time, and I texted him an apology through the number he'd given me, keeping my tone warm but firm. His response came almost instantly, and it was polite, understanding even, but something about the speed of it unsettled me. Most people take a few minutes to type out a reply. His came back in seconds, like he'd already prepared it, like he'd anticipated exactly what I would say before I said it. 3 days after that, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. My daughter mentioned, casually, over breakfast, that a nice man had waved at her from across the street while she was walking home from the bus stop the day before. She said he'd smiled and told her she looked just like her mother. My hands went numb around my coffee mug. I asked her, as calmly as I could manage, to describe him, and every detail she gave me matched the man sitting in my kitchen days earlier. I called the school that morning and asked them to keep a closer eye on pickup and drop-off, without explaining why, because I didn't fully understand why myself, not yet. That same week, I started digging. I searched his name, the one he'd given me, across every platform I could think of, and found almost nothing. No social media presence older than a few years. No employment history I could verify. No trace of the life a man his age should have accumulated by now. It was like he'd appeared out of nothing around the same time he reappeared in mine, which made no sense unless the identity he'd given me wasn't entirely real, or wasn't the only one he'd used. I sat with that thought for a long time, turning it over in my mind, feeling the walls of the safe, ordinary life I'd built for myself and my daughter start to feel a little thinner than they had a week before. The gratitude I'd carried for 10 years hadn't disappeared, but it had started sharing space with something else entirely, something sharper, something that made me lock my doors twice and check the windows before bed for the first time since we'd moved into this house. That weekend, I decided to do something I probably should have done 10 years ago. I pulled every article, every police report, every scrap of documentation I could find about the accident itself, determined to find some official record of the man who'd pulled me from the wreckage. If he was as real as he claimed, there had to be a paper trail. Witnesses get interviewed. Good Samaritans get mentioned, sometimes even praised in local news coverage. I spent an entire evening scrolling through archived articles from that week 10 years ago, and I found exactly what I expected to find about the crash itself, the truck driver's citation, a brief paragraph about my hospitalization, a quote from my mother thanking the first responders. But nowhere, in any single article, in any police statement, in any account from that night, was there a single mention of an unidentified man who pulled a survivor from a burning vehicle before paramedics arrived. Not one witness mentioned him. Not one report referenced him. It was as if, officially, he had never been there at all. I remember sitting back in my chair, feeling the room tilt slightly, because for 10 years I had believed, without question, that the reason nobody could find him was because he'd simply slipped away before anyone thought to ask his name. But an act like that, hands bleeding from prying open a car door seconds before it went up in flames, doesn't go unnoticed. Someone would have seen him. Someone would have mentioned him, even in passing. Unless he hadn't arrived after the crash at all. Unless he had already been there, already present, for reasons that had nothing to do with rescuing anyone. I thought back to what he'd told me at my kitchen table, that he'd been driving behind me for nearly 20 minutes before the truck ran the light. I thought about how specifically he remembered the song on my radio, the angle of the wreckage, details that belonged to someone who had been paying very close attention long before anything went wrong. And I thought about the truck itself, the one that ran the red light, the one that was somehow never fully explained beyond a citation and a fine. My hands were shaking again as I opened a new search tab and typed in the truck driver's name, a detail I hadn't thought about in years, buried somewhere in an old article I'd forgotten I'd saved. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. I only knew that the story I'd told myself for a decade, the one where a stranger appeared out of nowhere and saved me out of pure selfless instinct, no longer held together the way it used to. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a much darker question had started to form, one I wasn't ready to say out loud yet, not even to myself. The truck driver's name led me somewhere I didn't expect. It took almost an hour of digging through old court records and archived local news, but I finally found a short article, barely 3 paragraphs long, about the case being settled quietly out of court years ago. No trial. No public statements. Just a brief mention that the driver had been cited for reckless endangerment and that the matter had been resolved privately between the involved parties. That phrase sat wrong with me immediately. Car accidents involving reckless driving don't usually get resolved privately unless someone with money, or motive, wants them to disappear quickly and quietly. I searched the truck driver's name alongside every variation of the stranger's name he'd given me, hoping for some kind of connection, some thread I could pull. And then I found it, buried in an old business directory from over a decade ago. The truck driver had once worked for a small private investigation firm, one that had shut down years before the accident, but one that, according to a single cached webpage I managed to find, had employed another man around the same time. A man whose photo, grainy and outdated, still made my chest tighten the moment I saw it. It was him. Younger, thinner, but unmistakably the same face that had been sitting at my kitchen table drinking my coffee just days earlier. My hands went cold. I sat there staring at that old photo for what felt like an eternity, trying to piece together what it meant, trying to find an explanation that didn't lead somewhere terrifying. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe he'd simply worked with the truck driver at some point in an unrelated job, years before any of this happened, and it meant nothing at all. But the timeline gnawed at me. If they'd known each other, worked together, even briefly, then the idea that they'd both simply happened to be on the same quiet stretch of road, at the same late hour, on the exact night of my accident, stopped feeling like fate and started feeling like something else entirely. Something planned. Something orchestrated. I thought about every warm smile he'd given me across my kitchen table, every detail he'd recited with such practiced ease, and for the first time, I let myself ask the question I'd been avoiding since the moment he mentioned my daughter's resemblance to me. What if the crash hadn't been an accident he happened to witness? What if it had been a moment he'd helped create, so that he could be the one to walk in afterward and become the hero I would owe everything to for the rest of my life? I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat at my kitchen table, the same table he'd sat at just days before, staring at that grainy photograph until the sun came up, trying to convince myself I was wrong, that I was chasing shadows built from 10 years of unprocessed trauma and a healthy dose of paranoia. But the more I stared at it, the more certain I became. This wasn't a coincidence stacked on top of a coincidence. This was a pattern, and I had been standing directly in the center of it without ever realizing it. I called my sister that morning, the only person I trusted enough to say the words out loud without immediately being told I was overreacting. I told her everything: the doorbell footage, the missing witness reports, the private investigation firm, the photo. She went quiet for a long moment on the other end of the phone, and then she said something that I will never forget. She reminded me that a few weeks before the accident, I had briefly dated someone who hadn't taken the breakup well, someone who had shown up outside my apartment uninvited more than once, someone I had eventually blocked and stopped speaking to entirely because it had started to frighten me. I had almost forgotten about him completely, filed away in the part of my memory reserved for uncomfortable things I didn't want to examine too closely. My sister asked me, carefully, gently, if I had ever seen a photo of that man clearly enough to recognize his face a decade later. My stomach dropped through the floor. I hung up the phone and immediately started searching: old messages, old social media accounts I hadn't touched in years, anything that might still have a photo buried in it. It took almost 20 minutes of scrolling through deleted, archived, half-forgotten corners of the internet, but I found one. A single blurry photo from a group event, him standing slightly off to the side, half turned away from the camera. It wasn't a perfect match. 10 years changes a face in ways that make certainty difficult. But something in the shape of his jaw, the set of his shoulders, made the room tilt again beneath me. I sat there holding my phone with both hands, feeling something between grief and rage rising in my chest, because if I was right, if even a fraction of what I was starting to suspect was true, then the man I had thanked with tears in my eyes, the man I had let into my home, the man who now knew where my daughter went to school, had not saved my life out of pure selfless instinct at all. He had orchestrated the very danger he then pulled me out of, engineering the one story that would guarantee I would never suspect him, never fear him, never stop opening my door to him. And worse than that, some small, cold part of me understood that gratitude this deep doesn't just fade quietly. It has to be confronted, directly, to his face, before it destroys the fragile sense of safety I had left. I spent the next 3 days in a strange, quiet kind of panic, the kind that doesn't look like panic from the outside because you're still making breakfast, still driving your daughter to school, still smiling at neighbors like nothing in your life has cracked open. But underneath all of it, I was building a plan, because I knew, with a certainty I couldn't fully explain, that he would come back. Men like this don't disappear once they've reinserted themselves this deeply into someone's life. They escalate. So I did the one thing that felt like taking back control for the first time in 10 years. I set up a second camera, hidden inside a small potted plant on my porch, angled toward the front door, and I told my sister everything, giving her his description, his supposed name, the timeline, in case anything happened to me and I needed someone to already know where to point the police. I didn't call the police myself yet, not because I didn't want to, but because everything I had was circumstantial: a blurry old photo, a resemblance, a gut feeling stitched together from fragments that wouldn't hold up as proof to anyone but me. I needed him to say something, to slip, to confirm what I already believed in my bones. For days after our last conversation, my doorbell camera lit up again, this time at just past 8 in the evening, early enough that my daughter was still awake upstairs doing homework. I watched him on the screen, standing there in the same jacket, holding nothing this time, no gift bag, no forced warmth in his posture. Just standing there, waiting, like he already knew I would answer. And for the first time since this entire nightmare began, I didn't feel afraid in the way I had before. I felt something colder and steadier settle into my chest, because I finally understood that fear had been keeping me polite, keeping me quiet, keeping me opening doors I should have kept locked from the very beginning. I sent my daughter a quick text asking her to stay upstairs and not come down no matter what she heard, told her I was on an important call, and made sure my phone was recording before I opened the door. He smiled at me the moment I stepped into the doorway, that same practiced, warm smile that had fooled me completely just 2 weeks earlier. But this time, I didn't smile back. I looked at him, really looked at him, and asked him a question I already knew the answer to, watching carefully to see exactly how long it would take for that mask to slip. I asked him, as calmly as I could manage, why he had never once been mentioned in any police report, any witness statement, any single piece of documentation from the night of the accident, despite pulling a woman from a burning car with his bare hands. For a moment, he just stood there on my porch, and I watched something shift behind his eyes, something that had nothing to do with the warm, grateful reunion he'd been performing for 2 weeks. His smile faltered, just slightly, at the corners, the kind of falter you'd miss if you weren't looking for it, but I was looking for it now with everything I had. He recovered quickly, laughing softly, saying he'd never wanted the attention, that he'd left before anyone could ask his name because heroes don't do it for recognition. It was a good answer. It had worked on me once already. But I pressed further, telling him I knew about the private investigation firm, about the truck driver, about the timeline that placed him behind me on that road for nearly 20 minutes before anything went wrong. And that's when I watched the mask fully come off for the first time. His posture changed first, his shoulders squaring in a way that felt less like a grateful old acquaintance and more like someone bracing for confrontation. His voice dropped, losing every trace of the warmth it had carried across my kitchen table, and he asked me, very quietly, who I had been talking to. Not what I meant. Not whether I was mistaken. Who I had been talking to. It was the first honest question he had asked me since he'd reappeared in my life, and it told me everything I needed to know. I told him I knew about the man I'd dated years before the accident, the one who wouldn't take no for an answer, the one whose photo, blurry and years old, matched his face closely enough to make my hands shake every time I looked at it. He didn't deny it. He didn't confirm it either. He simply stood there on my porch, in the same cold light that had first revealed his face on my camera screen weeks earlier, and let the silence between us stretch out long enough to answer the question on its own. Then he said something that I will hear in my head for the rest of my life. He said, I just wanted you to need me the way you were always supposed to. Not love me. Not be with me. Need me. And in that single sentence, 10 years of gratitude I had carried like a debt collapsed into something far darker, the horrifying realization that the worst night of my life might not have been an accident he happened to witness, but a moment he had carefully engineered, just so he could become the one person I would never think to fear. I don't remember exactly what I said back to him in that moment. My body moved before my mind fully caught up, and I remember stepping back, putting the width of the doorway between us, my hand finding the edge of the door frame like it could somehow anchor me to the ground. He didn't move toward me, not exactly, but something in his stance shifted again, that same recalculating look I'd seen at my kitchen table, the look of someone deciding which version of himself to show me next. I told him, in a voice that came out steadier than I felt, that I wanted him to leave and never come back. He looked almost hurt by that, which was somehow the most unsettling part of the entire exchange, as if in his mind he had done nothing wrong, as if orchestrating the worst night of my life so he could play the role of savior was simply an act of devotion I should have appreciated rather than feared. He said my name softly, the way he had that very first night in my kitchen, and told me I didn't understand, that everything he'd done because he loved me, because he'd been watching over me for years before that road, before that truck, before any of it, and that some connections are simply meant to happen no matter what it takes to make them real. I felt sick listening to him say it out loud, watching how easily the words left his mouth, like he'd rehearsed this exact confession 1,000 times in his head, waiting for the day I would finally ask the right questions. I told him I was calling the police, and that's when I saw the last piece of the mask fall away completely. His expression went flat, unreadable, and for the first time since he'd reappeared in my life, I felt real, physical fear standing in my own doorway, the kind that makes your whole body go cold and alert at once. He didn't threaten me outright. He didn't need to. He simply said, quietly, that he'd waited 10 years already, and that he could wait a little longer if he had to, before turning and walking back down my porch steps into the dark, disappearing around the corner of my street exactly the way he had vanished from the scene of the accident all those years ago. I stood frozen in my doorway for a long time after he left, my phone still recording in my trembling hand, my daughter's soft footsteps creaking upstairs as she came to the top of the staircase asking if everything was okay. I looked up at her, this child who had never known how close she'd come to losing her mother before she was even born, and I understood, with absolute clarity, that the man who saved my life had never truly let go of me at all. He had simply been waiting for the right moment to come back and collect what he believed I owed him. I called the police the moment he was out of sight, my hands shaking so badly I had to try twice before I could unlock my own phone. I gave them everything I had, the footage from both cameras, the old blurry photo from years ago, the details about the private investigation firm, the timeline that no longer made sense as a coincidence. The officer who came to my house that night listened carefully, wrote everything down, and told me something that both validated every fear I'd been carrying and terrified me even further. He said that cases like this, where someone engineers a traumatic event specifically to insert themselves as a rescuer, are rare, but not unheard of, and that the psychological term for it exists precisely because it has happened before, to other people, in other homes, with other doorbells lighting up on quiet evenings just like mine. He told me that without a confession or physical evidence directly tying him to the crash itself, they could investigate but couldn't guarantee an arrest, at least not yet, and that in the meantime, I needed to take every precaution seriously. A restraining order was filed within the week, though I knew, somewhere in the back of my mind, that a piece of paper had never stopped a man who had already proven he was willing to wait 10 years and orchestrate a near-fatal accident just to become someone I couldn't say no to. I changed my locks that same night. I moved my daughter's pick-up and drop-off schedule, coordinating quietly with her school to add extra verification for anyone attempting to collect her. I stopped posting anything online that could reveal our location, our routines, our lives, understanding now, far too late, how much of myself I had unknowingly handed to a stranger over the years without ever realizing he was watching. For weeks afterward, I barely slept. Every car that idled too long outside my house sent my heart into my throat. Every unfamiliar face at my daughter's school events made my stomach twist with a fear I hadn't fully processed even after the initial confrontation. I started seeing a therapist who specialized in trauma-related stalking, something I hadn't even known was a specific, recognized category of experience until I needed the words for what had happened to me. She helped me understand that what I had felt in those first few weeks, that overwhelming, guilt-laced obligation to trust him simply because of what he'd supposedly done for me, was not weakness or naivety. It was one of the most effective psychological traps a predator can build, because gratitude disarms suspicion in ways that fear alone never could. Nobody questions the person who saved their life. Nobody locks the door on the man who pulled them from a burning car. And that, she told me gently, is exactly why it works. It's been 3 months now since that night on my porch, and I haven't seen him again. At least not that I know of, though the not knowing is its own particular kind of exhausting. The police investigation is still technically open. Slow-moving in the way these things often are when the strongest evidence is a decade-old blurry photograph and a timeline built from cached web pages and gut instinct. Some days I feel a strange, hollow kind of grief underneath the fear, mourning the version of this story I believed for 10 years. The one where a selfless stranger appeared out of nowhere and gave me a second chance at life simply because it was the right thing to do. That version of the story got me through some of the hardest nights of my recovery. It made the trauma feel a little less senseless, gave it a shape I could hold on to, a hero at the center of the wreckage instead of just twisted metal and fear. Losing that story, even though I know now it was never true, still feels like losing something real, because for a decade, it was the truth I lived by. My daughter has started asking careful, age-appropriate questions about why we have a new alarm system, why I walk her all the way to her classroom door now instead of dropping her at the curb, why we don't post pictures online the way some of her friends' families do. I've told her a simplified version, that a man from a long time ago isn't a safe person to be around, and that we're being careful, the same way we're careful crossing busy streets or swimming in deep water. She's accepted it the way children often accept the strange new rules adults put in place without fully understanding why, trusting that I know something she doesn't, which, in this case, is exactly right. I've also had to sit with an uncomfortable truth that I didn't expect to face when this all started, which is that my instincts tried to warn me from the very first night, that quiet, cold feeling underneath the joy of reunion, and I overrode it, again and again. Because gratitude felt like the more appropriate emotion to perform, even when my body was telling me something entirely different. I think about that a lot now, how many of us are taught, in small and large ways, to prioritize politeness and obligation over our own instinctive sense of danger, especially when the person in front of us has a story that makes saying no feel almost morally impossible. I don't think I'm unique in that. I think a lot of people have opened doors, physically and emotionally, to someone who set off every internal alarm, simply because the social script in front of them didn't leave room for suspicion. That if there's one thing I want you to take away from everything I've shared, it's this: gratitude is not the same thing as safety, and owing someone your life does not obligate you to hand them access to it indefinitely. If you ever find yourself in a situation where someone's story doesn't quite add up, where the details feel too perfect, too rehearsed, too convenient. Trust that feeling even if you can't immediately explain it with facts and evidence. Predators who use rescue as a foundation for control are counting on the fact that you will feel too guilty, too indebted, too socially obligated to question them, and that guilt is the exact mechanism they exploit. If something similar has happened to you, or is happening to you right now, please know that trauma-related stalking is a recognized, documented pattern, and you are not paranoid for noticing inconsistencies that don't sit right. Start documenting everything quietly: dates, times, specific details of conversations, any camera footage you have access to, because circumstantial evidence, piece by piece, can eventually become enough to act on. Reach out to local law enforcement even if you're not sure your evidence is strong enough yet, because a documented pattern of concern matters more than people realize when building a case over time. Talk to a therapist who specializes in trauma and stalking behavior if you have access to one, because the psychological weight of realizing someone you trusted completely may have engineered your suffering is not something you should have to process alone. And, perhaps most importantly, give yourself permission to prioritize your own safety and your instincts over the pressure to be grateful, polite, or hospitable to anyone, regardless of what they've done for you in the past. A genuine act of kindness never requires ongoing access to your home, your children, or your sense of safety as repayment. If someone frames their presence in your life as a debt you owe rather than a relationship you're choosing, that in itself is worth paying close attention to. I share this story not for sympathy, but because I know I'm not the only person who has felt that cold, contradictory pull between gratitude and fear, and I wanted someone else out there, sitting with that same quiet unease about a person in their life, to know they're not imagining it, that I still don't know, fully, whether I will ever get real closure on what happened that night 10 years ago, or whether the man who calls himself my savior will ever face any real consequence for what I now believe. He set in motion long before he ever pulled me from that wreckage. Some nights, I still catch myself staring at my doorbell camera a little too long, waiting for that familiar face to appear again, waiting to find out if this story is truly over or simply paused. But I've stopped waiting for gratitude to answer that question for me, and I've started trusting the quiet, instinctive voice I ignored for far too long, the one that knew something was wrong the very first night his face appeared on my screen. If this story affected you the way I hope it did, if it made you sit up a little straighter, made your chest tighten the way mine still does thinking about it, I want you to do something for me before you go. Subscribe to this channel right now, because I share stories exactly like this one every single week, real accounts of people who trusted the wrong person for the right reasons, and learned, sometimes just in time, to listen to the instincts that society so often teaches us to override. Hit that notification bell too, because these stories don't always come with warning, and I don't want you to miss the next one that might just help you recognize a pattern in your own life before it's too late. Drop a comment below and tell me honestly, would you have opened that door the way I did, or would your instincts have stopped you sooner than mine did? I read every single comment, and this community has become one of the most important places I have for processing what happened to me, so please, don't scroll past without leaving your voice here too. And if you know someone in your life who has ever felt that same confusing pull between gratitude and fear towards someone who claims to have saved them, send them this video, because sometimes the only thing standing between someone and real danger is a story that finally gives them permission to trust what they already know deep down. Thank you for staying with me through this entire story. I'll see you in the next one, and until then, please, always trust that quiet voice, because it is very rarely wrong.